You've heard me denigrate Hollywood before for doing history a disservice, but sometimes they can actually do it right, albeit rarely. Hey, Cypher here with another episode of Based on a True Story. I can't be negative all the time, and Hollywood actually has some shining examples of accuracy in movies. Although, I would argue that these examples only show how bad the rest of Hollywood's historical movies really are. Hollywood makes a lot of historical movies, and it's worth seeing how they could be better. So this is more of a guide of how to make a good historical movie, through some examples. And don't worry about spoilers, there's none here.
Out of all the history movies I have seen, and I watch as much as I possibly can, there is a very short list of ones I consider to be accurate enough. You can see them scrolling through. That's it. And I've combed the dregs to make this list. Seriously, out of hundreds of movies, these are the few I would choose. I must say right out, none are perfect, but these are as close as one should expect when the words "based on a true story" come on the screen. I could gush on how much I adore these movies, but I'll keep it brief. Firstly, my favorite of the batch. Patton focuses on the exploits of General George S. Patton during World War II. There were some important parts cut out for the theatrical release, but they were minor, and they were added to the Blu-ray. Some minor problems with its accuracy has to do with the equipment. They often use tanks that were not available in World War II, sometimes ranks and insignia are incorrect, and other minor issues. The story itself is totally unaffected by these inaccuracies, and some of them are just infeasible for a production company to do. While I would love to see dozens of Sherman tanks squaring off in battle, M47 Patton tanks are just fine by me. Besides, this was the first time the real US Army played any major role in a big Hollywood production. Now we see it in Transformers and other stuff like that, but this was the first time, really, that the US Army was contracted. The main point is that these cosmetic problems did not change the narrative. The narrative is ripped directly from two specific books on the subject, including a well-researched biography. This film gets extra, imaginary points for having such an identical-looking actor. It also doesn't glorify or denigrate his faults, but portrays them as just happening, leaving it open for interpretation. My one major gripe is that I would have liked to have seen his life prior to World War II, but that is not the focus of the movie. They probably do well to avoid that anyways, because that might require some falsification. Coppola, the director, showed how much he could screw up a narrative with his farcical rendition of The Great Gatsby. The Patton estate had control over the movie's production, so they probably pushed for accuracy. The next movie is The Message. Most people have never heard of this movie, but it is probably the best example of accuracy I've seen. And that is no small feat, because it is taking a very difficult subject for that matter. It is about Muhammad, as in the religious figure. That is difficult to do in documentary form, let alone as a good story, but they pulled it off. Firstly, as is traditional, Muhammad himself is never depicted. He never speaks. We see events through the Mohammedans themselves. Akkad, the director, does not show everything as holier than thou or some sort of miraculous event, but mostly a man with a message to preach. He even shows the darker parts of early empire building, and mentions some of the following caliph struggle. The closest he comes to the miraculous is how a spiderweb saved the early followers from being hunted out of existence, but that is depicted as naturally occurring. The movie also doesn't depict Muhammad's time in Jerusalem, so as to avoid the miraculous. Considering how troublesome religious stuff is, Akkad consulted clerics and scholars to create as accurate a portrayal as possible. It's a hidden gem of a movie. Black Hawk Down does well by narrowly defining its subject matter. The focus is only on the Battle of Mogadishu, rather than the entire intervention. Just like in Patton, real soldiers acted the parts. While there are several minor inaccuracies, they do not affect the narrative in any significant way. This movie too was based on the book. There was a character name swap, but that was for public relations reasons, because the guy committed a despicable crime right before the filming. Otherwise, the only inaccuracy complaints come from the enemy combatants. And yes, that means Somalis are watching this movie. Otherwise, it's great. Judgement in Nuremberg is a meticulously put together movie. The testimony given is made of direct quotes from the actual trials. It takes some liberties with the backstory, but the focus is the trouble with prosecuting crimes that were legal at the time of their committing, and does that beautifully. The movie looks at only one minor part of the trials, but that is a good thing, since they are able to show the troubles with one example, rather than trying to string together the whole thing. It is slow, but builds to quite an emotional finale. Apollo 13 is a technical masterpiece. Some of the pioneering effects in this movie put to shame the inaccuracies of the much acclaimed movie Gravity. The sets were built for accuracy, which were actually airtight, and they did vomit comet rides to simulate microgravity. Most importantly, every step of the way was checked by actual NASA personnel on set, and nearly all the dialogue between Control and the astronauts is taken from the real transcript. The inaccuracies that are depicted are mostly to save time and explanation, and they do not affect the narrative. They also don't focus too much on the astronauts' outside lives, choosing to look at the mission itself. The Lost Battalion is a made-for-TV movie, and is well worth watching. It focuses on the exploits of the titular US Army battalion during its famous World War I battle. Amazingly, the gore passes television censorship. It does everything that is great about Patton, but looking at a very famous World War I battle. Furthermore, it manages to depict the horrors of war without changing the narrative significantly, which is especially hard for a made-for-TV movie. Some honorable mentions go to Clint Eastwood's two films about Iwo Jima, The Glenn Miller Story, and We Were Soldiers, which I don't include as sufficient because the source material for these is too sparse to justify the depictions made. They managed to be surprisingly accurate accounts, despite the insufficiency of the source material.
So do you see a pattern on all these? There's one little thing that all of these do that the rest of Hollywood movies don't. They don't try to make a story out of history. This is a valuable thing to understand because it teaches us something about history itself. We don't need to make a story out of it because history already is a story. It's the never-ending story and the greatest story ever told, all wrapped up in one. When Hollywood alters the narrative to fit its three-act structure, they don't understand this, and they fundamentally miscomprehend the subject matter that they wish to depict. These examples manage to accomplish this by doing a few specific things. They are adaptations of non-fiction materials without significant alterations. Furthermore, they avoid expanding the plot too much so that they don't have to try to crunch it down and make some alterations there. Another thing to notice, despite their dedication to historical accuracy, they managed to make really good movies. All of these in this list are highly acclaimed and are just good movies in and of themselves. So those naysayers who say it's impossible to do accuracy in a movie haven't studied cinema that well. Lastly, I want to make one historiographic note. Historians hardly ever agree on how to interpret events. Since every narrative implies a particular narrative bent, these movies obviously have to have their own bent. And so they've been criticized, every single one of them, on that interpretation. But at least they haven't altered the facts enough to change the narrative. And that's the important bit. So be sure to tell me what historic movies need busting in the comments. These are all the accurate ones I could find, out of the hundreds that I know of. Be sure to subscribe and check out the last based on a true story. I'll see you next time.